You're listening to the Corbett Report.
All right, well, James, I brought you on the program today to speak about anarchy. This is something I've become very fascinated with over the past couple of years, and I was hoping to discuss with you about how we can actually move towards this type of social organization. So, James, there are many misconceptions about anarchy, and for the sake of clarification, could you define anarchy as you understand it?
Now, you see, this is really the heart of the entire issue, so we could probably spend the entire time on this question alone. And I don't want to be evasive about it, and I'm not trying to be coy or to make this into a more grandiose answer than it needs to be. But I honestly believe that that if there is anything at all that is indicative of anarchism, it is that anarchism is not a singular ideology with a singular definition or a singular purpose that looks one particular way or another. It's not that type of ideology at all. I would say it's an ecosystem of ideologies, some of which are non-exclusionary, are compatible, some of which are completely opposed and at odds, so that you can have collectivist anarchism and individualist anarchism, you can have revolutionary anarchism, you can have pacifist anarchism, you can have atheist anarchism, you can have Christian anarchism, you can have communist anarchism, socialist anarchism, high-tech anarchism, primitivist anarchism, industrial anarchism, environmentalist anarchism, property abolitionist anarchism, free market anarchism, mutualist anarchism. I could go on, but I hope that at least paints part of the picture that I'm trying to paint here. Again, there are so many different aspects to this. Perhaps the best way to approach the question of what is anarchy, maybe what are anarchies might be a better way of framing that, is to look at the word itself. Of course, anarchism comes from the root word anarchy, which of course comes from the Greek word anarchos, which just means one without ruler. And this, of course, lends itself to all sorts of debate in and of itself. What does that mean, one without ruler? Does that mean simply that this is against government, per se, or is this against all forms of hierarchical organization? And again, you get different answers from different branches of anarchical thought. And so I find it interesting. Anarchism certainly is a topic that is becoming more commonly debated and talked about online. But in these bastions of philosophical debate, like the comment section of youtube.com, people tend to be very, very certain about the very simple definition of anarchism. And I always tend to laugh at that because it generally denotes to me someone who's never actually picked up a book and read any of these things, which is why I started the Well-Read Anarchist podcast, which at this point is a very halting and hasn't progressed very far. But hopefully in the coming weeks, months, and years, we will be going over a number of different works of some of the foundational anarchist thinkers. We're starting right now with the person who was the first self-identified anarchist, at any rate. I wouldn't say that he was the first anarchist per se, but the first person who identified himself as an anarchist, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who wrote, his famous work is What is Property?, taking a look at again, the concept of property and how that applies or doesn't apply, and that was really the basis for a lot of anarchical thought in the early to mid 19th century when this was first being formalized. But again, this touches on not only economic organization, not only political organization, not only social organization, but I think it also touches on issues of praxeology. What can we take at base? And that's the direction from which I approach it. So in fact, I am one of those people who does not actually even use the term anarchist in my self-definition, because I just think it has become so broad, so diverse, that as a label it is almost useless. And I can sympathize with the people in your audience who might be sick of all of these special little snowflakes claiming they can't possibly put a label to their ideology because they're so complex. So if there was a gun put to my head and I had to in one way or another define myself, I suppose I would identify with the term voluntarist, which comes from the idea of voluntarism, which again brings with it its own baggage that I don't necessarily intend. It's usually associated with the so-called anarcho-capitalist philosophy, which there are many anarchists who would say is not anarchism, but at any rate, it generally bases itself not on the economic arguments or the political arguments, but on the ethical principle that all forms of human association should be voluntary in nature. And that's what I identify with. Fundamentally, I think that that ethical construct allows for all various forms of social and economic and political compacts, so long as they follow that rule that the people associating in those compacts are doing so voluntarily. I for one don't have a problem with anyone choosing to organize themselves in a different way than I would, and I think that's what it comes down to me. It's not an economic or a social or a political structure. It is an ethical principle, and that's what I identify with. So I'm sorry to take the very, very long route towards answering your question, but unfortunately there's no way around it. This is just one of those things that I think anyone approaching anarchism has to deal with.
That's actually how I understood it too, was that it's kind of more of an ethical framework more than anything else. And in what you were just talking about in your well-read Anarchist podcast, reading some of the works of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, he said that if you wanted political equality, abolish property. Now, what does this mean to you?
Well, Proudhon approached this from the perspective of looking at the idea of property ownership, and what it is at base is, of course, the idea that a property owner can do what he wants with his property, including using it, abusing it, using it up, and even destroying it. And this was something that he had a problem with when we're talking about such things as people who own, for example, a patch of land or a patch of land that has on it a body of water or what have you. This obviously starts to become problematic because, of course, it means that ultimately humans have the right through property to basically destroy the earth itself and to deprive future generations of the use of that. So this was what he was looking at in that work, and in a very interesting manner, I think. There's, of course, a lot of knee-jerk reactions that will be put up depending on what perspectives people are coming from in this, but I think that does a disservice to the argument that he's putting together, that there's a difference between property ownership, as we just defined it, and rightful possession. I.e., you can have possessions that are yours and that you have the rightful use of, but that does not necessarily mean that you have that right not only into perpetuity, but also to give to your descendants, and that they also have that right, and that they can basically monopolize, for example, a patch of the earth and do with it as they will. And that, again, it's a complicated philosophy, and one that branches out in a lot of different directions, and one that I don't think Pierre-Joseph Proudhon necessarily came to his own definitive understanding of throughout his life. There were a lot of contradictions in his own thought. For example, he was the one who came up with the idea, or at least advocated the idea, of spontaneous order being the organizing principle of society, i.e. through voluntary interactions, people will come to an order that they could not otherwise come to in a system of authoritarian governmental system structures. And this is the basis of modern-day mutualist economic theory. However, Proudhon himself was actually a politician in his own day and age, and he did actually side in numerous political issues with socialists rather than with anarchists. So he had his own contradictions in terms of what he was arguing, and I think you can see that when you start to take a look at the broader scope of his work.
Mm-hmm. And looking at at how basically anarchy would play itself out, one might ask the question, but who would build the roads?
Yes, indeed. The age-old question. And the funny thing I think about the question itself is that the question, of course, is used by those who are coming at this from a statist mindset, i.e. people who advocate the idea that we do need some sort of government in order to organize society, because there are certain types of activities, like building roads, that simply could not be done in any other way. And I think the irony of this particular example is that the only thing that the government does in our modern day society is take the collective will that almost everyone shares, that we do need roads to conduct our transactions, and take that as the excuse to use the money which the government itself extracts from the populace to then give to companies that then build the roads. So, in fact, the real answer, even in our own society, is that corporations and companies tend to actually build the roads. But in this society, the way it's structured currently, we have this middleman called government that is seen to be this benevolent force that is doing it. But of course, that is not really the case. So there are a number of different ways to answer this. And I think that perhaps we could get more to the kind of underlying part of this question, because of course the underlying part is that is to say that there are certain things that simply cannot be done without some sort of hierarchical structure of people who make a decision or come to a decision in some manner and then enact it. And if we can't do that, then how can we organize society? And again, I think that this shows a reticence on the behalf of many people, and I think an understandable reticence to believe in the idea of spontaneous order, of the idea that voluntary, peaceful interactions can bring about the things that we want collectively, just as assuredly as a body claiming to have authority over everyone that can ultimately resort to violence has the ability to enact that order. And I say it's understandable that people are reticent to believe that because we in our society, the way that we are today, I agree. If all of the controls, all of the hierarchical institutions, if government itself was just suddenly eradicated from the face of the earth overnight, I don't think we would be equipped as a society, as a civilization, to really handle that, because we are steeped, obviously, in certain political and economic and social constructs that we have been in all of our lives to basically to accept this authority from on high, and we are not equipped with the resources that I think we would need in order to understand how to interact with each other in order to accomplish things without that parental governmental figure in mediating between us. And I don't think that's an insoluble problem. I do think that we can learn how to negotiate and interact with others in peaceful and voluntary ways in order to achieve what we want. But it is a skill that has, like a muscle, has to be trained, has to be used in order to be built up. And since we do not use it in our current society, it's very analogous to the family structure. I think that the best analogy for what the government is of course the parental authority figure, both the mother figure and the father figure. There's the father authority figure that tells people how to live and punishes them if they don't, and also the maternal figure that provides the cradle to grave swaddling clothes of ever loving milk of government to take care of all of us and wipe our nose and wipe our bottoms when we have a doo-doo. And this is and when you've grown up and lived your entire life in such a system, of course you become used to that structure to the point where you do not know how to interact with those around you without that mediating authority. So we'll go and tell dad, oh, he hit me, what are you going to do about it? Or we'll go to mom, oh, I'm hungry, please feed me. And of course, just as in the family structure, we eventually, as human beings, have to grow into independent adults who are able to fulfill these needs for ourselves. So too politically, I think there is a time when we will have to grow up and become independent adults who learn how to do these things without the need for that intermediary figure. But as I say, we are nowhere close to that point today, and that will take really a revolution in consciousness. I don't think there's any other way to get from here to there. And so I'm not proposing that these types of ideas are anything that can or would be effectively instituted overnight. But I think it is something that we have to be aware of and consciously working towards, because I don't think there's any way we're going to accidentally stumble into this, especially when we are in a society that's very much infested with people who do want to control others and use those tools of governmental authority and other types of hierarchical authority to keep people in that state of dependency. It's a very sick society that we find ourselves in, and I think everyone understands that on a certain level. The question, of course, is how we get from here to there, and I think fundamentally it's more about consciousness, it's more about education than it is about some sort of particular political process or economic process.
Yeah, it's definitely tough too, because in today's society we definitely have a trend towards the artificial extension of childhood. So it really does seem to me a very childish notion that people would really ask the question, well, who would build the roads and who would clean the toilets? Because I'll tell you something right now, if I looked around me in an anarchist society and I saw nobody was cleaning the toilets, I'd open up a business to clean toilets and make a killing, because I would have a monopoly on cleaning toilets. So this is kind of like something that people don't really take into consideration when thinking about an anarchist society, because it would just run basically on free market capitalism. And since there would be no taxes, people really wouldn't have to worry that much about things like healthcare because you would be able to afford it, and there wouldn't be the insurance companies getting in the way and then hiking the prices up because Obama wants to do Obamacare, or I live in Massachusetts where Romney or Deval Patrick wants to do the Massachusetts healthcare. Here in Massachusetts, we actually got to see Obamacare a couple of years before they pushed it through in the entire country. And I'll tell you something, my pocket really can't take much more of this. This is Taxachusetts all the way. And I find it increasingly more difficult just to live. And it's kind of forced me to the conclusion quicker than I may have reached it myself, that this system just can't work much longer. And
well, let me dispute what you said there, because I of course I do agree. Personally, I would argue for those types of economic solutions to the problems that you talked about. But I realize there are going to be people in the audience who do not like the sound of those types of solutions. Oh, so we have to pay people in order to clean the toilets, and this is how it's all going to work. And if you're too poor, then you'll just have dirty toilets, that type of thing. And I want to stress once again that I don't think it's fundamental to anarchism itself, or even the idea of an anarchical society, that it would that all societies, all communities would be organized on those capitalist principles. I think there would be groups, communities that do try to organize through collective ownership, collective distribution of wealth, etc. And I personally wouldn't want to live in those communities because I do think they are destined to fail. But I certainly would not dispute anyone's right to attempt to live in those communities or to form them and to prove me wrong. Because ultimately, once again, this is not about my particular idea of how people should live their lives, or in fact, any individual's idea of how people should live their lives. I think it's about allowing people the freedom and the liberty and the space to construct whatever type of community they are most comfortable living in. And why should you care what I think about whether or not it will work? The point is not to argue with me. The point is to create the community that you want. And again, I say I would obviously gravitate towards the anarcho-capitalist community, but I'm certainly not in any way saying that's the only type of community that could exist in an anarchical society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just that's the way that I would see it working best anyway. Now, have you seen any movements around the world that have anarchist tendencies or see any on the horizon?
Yes and no. I mean, there are obviously organizations and institutions out there that self-identify as anarchist and that attempt in their own way to organize as anarchist. And in fact, I mean, one thing that we can point to in recent years, the anti-globalization movements and that really started to come to a head in the Battle of Seattle back in 2000, I believe it was, the World Trade Organization protests, etc., was heavily influenced by anarchist groups. Again, keeping in mind that anarchism traditionally, the traditional roots of anarchism has been in a radical left ideology. It's only in more recent years that anarcho-capitalism has been changing people's conception of what anarchism might be. But there's been a lot of socialist-leaning and communist-leaning activists who call themselves anarchism. The anti-globalization movement has been one of those places where those groups have come to the fore. But of course, it's also led to the Black Bloc and things like this, which of course a lot of people who do not really study these things tend to automatically associate with anarchism. And that's, I think, another reason why I think anarchism is a problematic word in and of itself, because it brings with it the associations not only of chaos and violence and just total anarchy, as as people usually say, but also because it does have those specific connections in the popular cultural imagination to violent, radical bomb throwers, Russian bearded bomb throwers and assassins. And there have been waves of terror caused by self-identified anarchists in the past, including a period from the early 1880s until 1914 of a wave of assassinations of political leaders that were committed by people calling themselves anarchists who said they were undergoing something called the propaganda of the deed, i.e. they were trying to do something in order to show what the anarchist ideology was, and that something was killing world leaders as a type of statement, I guess. And so we saw U.S. President McKinley, for example, and of course culminating in the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which set off World War I. So there has been these waves of terror that have been caused by anarchists in the past, and that's what a lot of people associate with them. So when we talk about, for example, the anti-globalization movement, most people will think of these black, dressed in black, masked goons who go around throwing things through Starbucks shop windows as if that's a great political statement. Of course, I think there is much more to be said about that phenomenon and what forces are really behind it, including, of course, in 2007 at the Montebello protests, where there was protests specifically against something called the SPP, the Security and Prosperity Partnership, that was a type of nascent North American union that activists were very concerned about. There was at those protests a group, two masked individuals who were seen to be carrying rocks and threatening the police line, who ended up getting taken in by the police and were identified as, and eventually admitted to be actually a policeman. They were policemen who had been dressed up as protesters who were starting to try to entice the police into acting against the protesters. So I think we can see something of that phenomenon in these mysterious masked men who show up. And for example, in the 2010 Toronto G20 summit, there were the masked anarchists, quote unquote, who showed up and set the police car on fire, and that became the iconic image of the G20. And again, there are very, very important questions about who these people were, where they came from, and why some of them were allowed to run behind the police line as they were running away from some of the other protesters. So again, I think that there's a lot of manipulation that goes on to try to create that link in people's minds between anarchism and violence. And unfortunately, it's been very effective. So a lot of people see that the so-called anarchists in the anti-globalization movement that are going around smashing things and setting things on fire and say that that must be anarchism. Whereas I think that the actions taken by a lot of the protesters at something like the Battle of Seattle back in 2000, linking their arms together and refusing to move, and that type of peaceful protest was probably more, I think, reflective of the anarchist elements there. But at any rate, that's one example of a place where we see a flowering of this. But to be honest, I don't think there's a lot of very effective anarchist organization going on in the world right now because, again, I think that there's an awful lot of time that's spent kind of navel-gazing in anarchist circles about and also about hyphenization. It's anarcho-syndicalist or anarcho-communist or anarcho-capitalist or individualist anarchist or collectivist anarchist, so that people tend to wall themselves into very, very small corners and refuse to associate with other groups to the point where they are unable to accomplish anything. So you'll find online there are websites that are devoted to anarchist writings and anarchist thought, and there's a lot of philosophical conversation going on, but not a lot that I say you can really point to as in terms of what's happening in a real sense that you can actually see on the ground that's changing anything. And again, I don't put a lot of stock in that at this particular moment because I think this is more about really a generational process of preparing society for the idea of letting go of their rulers, which is an interesting concept because usually we tend to think that the rulers have control of us. I think ultimately, it's the other way around. And once we realize that, and it's that we are the ones who are gripping onto our rulers in a type of perverse Stockholm syndrome, once we realize that, then we can let go of those rulers. We can form the types of societies and communities that we want. And all of this, the protest and everything that's necessary, I think will not be necessary at that point. I think it will be more a process of letting go of the old structures and creating our own. And once we reach that point, I think we will be on the cusp of becoming political adults.
Yeah, and I've been doing a lot of research lately into the lead up to World War I, and the aftermath, and then the lead up to World War II. Been spending a lot of time in this area, and one thing that's become clear to me is that when you allow these gigantic international banks the amount of influence that they end up having over the political structure, they can exploit it to whatever ends that they want to, and it's what I think needs to be done first is that we need to get rid of the political structures that allow those people to have the influence over the power. It's that centralization of political action that makes it susceptible to infiltration and subversion, to exactly what you were just talking about with those police infiltrating those movements, and we've seen it all over the place. I mean, we've seen it in the Ukraine, seen it in Libya, seen it in Egypt, where the opposition is infiltrated and subverted. And what really has become clear to me is that, like I was saying, we need to get rid of the political structures that give them the opportunity to manipulate us like they do.
I actually picture it as the inverse. So I think that the bedrock, the foundation, the cornerstone is the ethical principle. Once again, I think that is what we need to have in place. And then any economic or social compact that arises on top of it, as long as it's in line with that ethical structure, I think would be allowable in my idea of an anarchical society. But on top of that, I would say that the economic or monetary structure is the first order of the superstructure, and then the political organization is the one that rises up on top of that.
Okay.
So rather than the political organization being the one that allows certain types of economic or monetary influence to come about, I think it's kind of the opposite. I think the political organization is really just an extension of the monetary organization of society. And in our modern monetary system that is based around these central banks that obviously have the ability to define money through the legal tender laws and these other things, which obviously would not exist in a society that did not have a government, a central government authority. They are able to create a monopoly on the most precious part of society, which is the ability to interact with each other. You and I and everyone else, our interactions are to some extent limited by by these types of laws and the existence of these central banks and the monetary system that we interact in. Because, again, they get to define what money is and how it's created. And, of course, in our current system, it's created through private banks creating money as debt, as loans that are then owed back at interest to the private banks. Great thing if you're a private bank, pretty bad if you're everyone else on the planet.
Yeah.
So this is obviously, I think that's the first order of the sort of the underlying superstructure, and the political superstructure on top of it. I don't know prescriptively which one would need to be dismantled first, or if we have to dismantle both together, or if you dismantle one, the other one will fall apart. Again, I wouldn't claim to know that because there are so many variables at play, and maybe that's above my pay grade. But it's certainly something that needs to be done. And I think unless and until we attack that fundamental issue of the monetary organization of society, I think it's a lost cause. Because again, you can really determine so much about the society we live in simply by controlling that one aspect of it. What do we use to interact with each other?
Okay, James, we're coming up to the end of the time that we have today. But is there any parting words you'd like to leave us with today, James?
Well, again, I really hope that people can approach the idea of anarchy and anarchism without too many preconceptions, because it's not only the kind of preconceptions that I think everyone identifies, which is that anarchy equals chaos or anarchy equals bomb throwers or what have you, but it's also the more subtle types of predetermined ideas that we have about anarchism. For example, I mean, people who are approaching it or only learning about it from the voluntarist or anarcho-capitalist positions might not know about the really deep and rich philosophical context of it that goes back more towards the socialist traditions than towards the capitalist traditions. And even if you disagree with that, I think it's incumbent on all of us to know more about it, which is why I'm trying to do this Well-Read Anarchist series, so that we can come to a better understanding of this philosophy. So again, maybe this entire conversation is just about really starting the conversation about what anarchism is or what it could be. But again, I think that perhaps that's appropriate, because ultimately I think anarchism is not a single prescriptive solution for everything. It's more like opening the door to the possibilities that we can imagine when we start to think about a society without specific authoritarian control. And I don't know about you, but I want to think about that type of society, and I want to start preparing myself and my son and future generations for that society, which I think is the primary task that we should all be engaged in thinking about it in these days. So hopefully you and the listeners out there can help join in on that process.
Absolutely, James. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. It was a pleasure.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on.
All right. Have a good day, James.
The Corbett Report is brought to you by the 2010 Video Archive DVD. Buy your copy today at corbettreport.com.